It was a bright afternoon in an upscale suburban neighborhood. White picket fences, trimmed lawns, and polished cars. But one thing disturbed the quiet perfection: music. Joyful laughter and soulful jazz floated from a backyard where guests in elegant African attire were gathering. Across the fence, Mrs. Whitman, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, frowned. "Those people don't belong here," she muttered, clutching her phone. Within minutes, she had called the cops. 2 police cars rolled up quietly, lights flashing faintly against the afternoon sun. Guests froze mid-laughter, musicians stopped playing, and the bride, a stunning black woman in white lace, turned pale. Mrs. Whitman stepped forward smugly, folding her arms. "There, officers. This is a quiet neighborhood. These people are making noise, and I don't think they even belong here," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. One of the officers walked past her and approached the groom, a tall, calm man in a sharp cream-colored suit. He didn't look angry, just disappointed. "Sir," the officer began carefully, "we got a noise complaint. May I ask who's hosting this event?" The man smiled faintly. "I am," he said. "My name's Marcus." Mrs. Whitman scoffed. "Marcus what?" He looked her right in the eyes. "Mayor Marcus Daniels," and just like that, the entire yard went silent. Mrs. Whitman's face drained of color. "Mayor?" she stammered, blinking rapidly. "That can't be you." Marcus kept his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. Elected last year. And today I'm marrying the love of my life, right here, in the community I serve." The officers exchanged stunned looks. One of them straightened instantly. "Apologies, sir. We didn't realize." Marcus raised a hand calmly. "You were just doing your job, officers. No harm done." Then, turning to Mrs. Whitman, his tone softened, but carried quiet strength. "You called the police on a wedding because you assumed we didn't belong here?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes darted between the mayor, the guests, and the cops, realization sinking in like a cold wave. Around them, the guests stood still, watching, not angry, not shouting, just silent, waiting. Marcus took a slow breath. "Next time, ma'am, before you judge the people around you, maybe try talking to them first." The officers nodded respectfully, then stepped back. The band picked up again. The guests cheered softly, and Mrs. Whitman quietly turned and walked away. As the music filled the garden again, Marcus looked at his bride, Amara, who smiled through tears. She squeezed his hand tightly. "Let it go," she whispered. "Today's about love, not hate." Marcus nodded, but his heart still ached. He glanced toward the gates where Mrs. Whitman had disappeared, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Then he looked back at his guests. Neighbors, friends, city workers, people from every background. They stood together, clapping, dancing, celebrating unity instead of division. The wedding continued, brighter than before. Children twirled in circles, elders laughed, and Marcus and Amara finally exchanged vows under strings of golden lights. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Marcus gave a small speech. "Love isn't color, status, or class," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's the bridge between hearts, and today, I'm reminded that every bridge starts with understanding." The crowd applauded, some with tears in their eyes. In a nearby window, unseen, Mrs. Whitman stood watching from her porch, eyes glistening, her pride melting into quiet regret. The next morning, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. The echoes of laughter and music from the wedding still lingered in the air, but so did the weight of what had happened. Mrs. Whitman sat by her kitchen window, her untouched cup of tea growing cold. She couldn't erase the image of the police saluting Marcus, or the words that had spread across the block like wildfire. The groom was the mayor. Her chest tightened with shame. She had always prided herself on being a good neighbor, yet last night had shown her how small her world had become. When she finally stepped outside, she saw a few neighbors talking near the gate where the wedding decorations still fluttered in the breeze. They looked at her, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. Mrs. Whitman hesitated, then took a deep breath and walked toward the house she had tried to humiliate. Amara opened the door. She froze for a second, then stood tall. Mrs. Whitman's voice trembled. "I came to apologize. What I did was wrong. I judged you and him, without even knowing who you were." Amara's expression softened, but she didn't speak. Just then Marcus appeared behind her, still in casual clothes, no security, no suit, just a man. He looked at the woman who had called the police on his wedding and said calmly, "You don't owe me an apology because of my title, Mrs. Whitman. You owe it because of what's right." Mrs. Whitman's eyes filled with tears. "You're right, and I'll spend every day trying to make it right." For the first time Amara smiled, not out of forgiveness but hope. "Then start today," she said gently. "Join us for coffee?" Mrs. Whitman blinked, surprised. "I'd like that." The three of them sat together on the porch, awkwardly at first, then slowly easing into conversation as the sun warmed the quiet street. It wasn't the perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a new kind of neighborly bond, built not from fear or judgment, but from understanding. Weeks passed after the wedding, and the shock that had rippled through the neighborhood began to fade, replaced by something new: reflection. Mrs. Whitman had changed. She no longer glanced suspiciously out her window when new families moved in. Instead, she walked over with a plate of cookies and a smile. Her words carried less pride now, more warmth. But it wasn't just her. The entire neighborhood started to shift. People who had once whispered about those people now found themselves waving across fences, curious instead of cautious. One Saturday morning, the community board held a meeting to discuss neighborhood projects. For the first time ever, Marcus and Amara were invited. When they entered the hall, silence fell. Not out of prejudice this time, but respect. Marcus, in his calm, confident tone, said, "A strong community doesn't come from the color of our skin or the size of our homes. It comes from how we treat each other when no one's watching." The room erupted in applause. Even Mrs. Whitman wiped away tears. Later, kids from different backgrounds played soccer on the same street where police cars had once parked. Amara joined the women's gardening club, and her laughter mixed with Mrs. Whitman's as they planted roses together, bright red and deep brown, side by side, just like the people around them one evening. Marcus looked at Amara under the golden sunset. "You know," he said softly, "that call, the one meant to ruin our day, might have just changed this entire neighborhood." Amara smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the ugliest moments plant the seeds for the most beautiful change." And as the sky turned to twilight, laughter echoed once more through the same streets, not out of mockery, but unity. A few months later, Mayor Marcus Daniels stood at the center of the same park where his wedding had been interrupted. The once empty lot now buzzed with people. Families, children, volunteers, painting benches, planting trees, and hanging banners that read, "Unity Square, a place for everyone." Amara stood by his side, wearing a simple white sundress, smiling as she watched kids of all races run around together. Mrs. Whitman was there too, holding a paintbrush, laughing with the young black boy who'd spilled color all over his hands. Marcus took the microphone, his deep voice carrying warmth. "When I was younger," he began, "I dreamed of a city where no one had to prove they belonged, where kindness didn't depend on complexion, and respect wasn't reserved for the powerful." He looked out over the crowd. Neighbors who had once turned their backs now stood side by side, united in purpose. "But dreams," he continued, "only come true when we choose to act, when we face our prejudice and replace it with understanding." The crowd clapped, some teary-eyed. Even the officers who had once arrived at his wedding in confusion stood proudly now, part of the volunteer team. Amara stepped forward, placing a hand over his heart. "And it starts small," she said softly into the mic. "A conversation, an apology, a hand extended instead of a wall raised." They unveiled a new plaque, gold letters engraved with, "Dedicated to every heart brave enough to change." Mrs. Whitman placed the first flower at its base, whispering, "Thank you for letting me try again." The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson. The sound of laughter, music, and life filled the air. Not from wealth, not from status, but from the quiet dignity of shared humanity. And as Marcus looked around, his eyes lingered on every smiling face. The same neighborhood that once divided them now stood as living proof that compassion, even when late, can rewrite history. A teenager with a drone had captured the entire unit. Within hours, the video exploded. Millions watched, comment sections filled with disbelief, tears, and hope. People couldn't stop sharing the clip of Mrs. Whitman, once the woman who called the cops, now painting beside the very family she once judged. Major news networks picked up the story. Headlines flashed across screens. From division to unity, Mayor Daniels turns racism into reform. Viral video sparks hope across the country. Schools began discussing the video in classrooms. Communities from Cairo to California started holding their own unity days. Even the police department used it for training, emphasizing empathy and cultural awareness. Marcus, overwhelmed by the response, received a call from an international human rights organization. They wanted him to speak at a global summit about grassroots healing. When he told Amara, she smiled through tears. "You didn't just change a neighborhood, Marcus," she said softly. "You reminded the world that one act of grace can echo forever." Later that night, Marcus scrolled through messages, hundreds of people writing how the story had inspired them to apologize, to forgive, to stand up. He paused at one comment that said, "I used to be like Mrs. Whitman. Today I brought coffee to my new neighbors. We talked, they're wonderful." He showed it to Amara. She read it and whispered, "See? Change isn't loud, it's contagious." They looked out the window at Unity Square, lights glowing gently under the night sky. A symbol born from conflict now shining as a beacon. Months later, Marcus and Amara found themselves stepping onto a grand stage in Geneva. The global summit hall was filled with world leaders, activists, educators, and ordinary people who had been touched by the viral story. The large screen behind them displayed a simple still image, Marcus and Mrs. Whitman shaking. When Marcus began to speak, his voice was steady but humble. "I didn't come here as a mayor," he said, pausing to look around. "I came here as a man who once believed change was impossible." He shared the story, not polished, not political, just honest, the prejudice, the humiliation, the call to the police, the transformation. He spoke of Amara's courage, of forgiveness that didn't come easily, and of a neighborhood reborn through grace. The hall was silent. Then a delegate from another country stood up and said, "Mr. Daniels, your story gave my community hope. We've started our own unity garden in memory of it." Another delegate from Africa added, "We've named our youth program Amara's Promise, to remind our children that forgiveness is power." Amara's eyes glistened. She squeezed Marcus's hand. When the applause erupted, it wasn't for fame or politics, it was for proof. Proof that one act of dignity could ripple across oceans. After the summit, they stepped outside into the cold evening air. Reporters surrounded them, flashes lighting up the night. But Marcus didn't smile for the cameras. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "This isn't about us. It's about what we all can become." Amara leaned against him, whispering, "And it all started with a wedding, and a woman who thought we didn't belong." They both laughed softly, not bitterly, but with the calm warmth of people who had seen the world change and knew the best was still to come. Years later, Unity Square had become more than just a park. It was a landmark of healing. Tourists came from all over to see where one act of prejudice had turned into a story of redemption. Children played under murals painted by artists who had once lived divided by color, creed, and fear. The most famous one showed two hands, one dark, one pale, holding a heart made of gold, and beneath it were the words, "We all belong." Marcus and Amara often visited quietly. They no longer needed cameras or speeches. The laughter around them said enough. Mrs. Whitman, now older, would sometimes sit on a bench there too, knitting scarves for the neighborhood kids. When she saw them, she would smile softly and say, "Thank you for not giving up on me." One evening, as the sun dipped low and the square shimmered in golden light, Amara turned to Marcus and said, Do you ever think about how different things could have been if we had let anger win? Marcus nodded, watching a group of children of every color chase each other through the fountain. Every day, he said, but then I remember, light doesn't prove its strength by fighting the dark, it proves it just by shining. They stood together as the park lights flickered on, each one like a tiny promise that kindness, though often quiet, could outlast hate, fear, and time itself. True greatness isn't built in boardrooms or written into law, it's built in the human heart. Every time someone chooses understanding over judgment, they build a bridge that outlives them. Every act of grace, no matter how small, travels farther than we ever imagine. Prejudice can break a moment, but compassion can rebuild generations. We all stumble, we all carry ignorance, and we all have the chance to rise above it. Forgiveness doesn't excuse the past, it transforms it. It takes what was broken and turns it into a blueprint for others to heal. In a world still divided by fear and pride, the bravest thing we can do is listen, learn, and love without condition. Because real strength isn't the ability to stand tall alone, it's the courage to kneel, reach out, and lift someone else up. And in the end, history doesn't remember who was richer, louder, or stronger. It remembers who chose to be kind when it was hardest, and how that single choice changed everything.